The whole town told him he was building it wrong and laughed while saying it. A broke veteran living alone with his loyal German shepherd placed his fireplace in the strangest corner of his cabin just weeks before winter hit. When the cold turned deadly and neighbors began freezing inside their own homes, his cabin stayed warm through the night. That stupid fireplace wasn't a mistake. It was a forgotten secret that ended up saving lives and changing the town forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter settled over Fargo like a silent verdict, flattening sound beneath snow and sharpening the air until every breath felt measured and deliberate. Walter Hayes stood alone inside his aging wooden cabin, the wind pressing against the walls with a steady, impatient force as if winter itself were testing him before he had even begun. At 73, Walter moved slower than he once had, but nothing about him suggested weakness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, despite the years his frame still carrying the square rigidity of a soldier who had once marched long distances with a heavy pack and heavier thoughts. A deeply lined face weathered by decades of North Dakota sun and Korean winters framed eyes that were pale gray and unsettlingly calm. His beard, once jet black, had faded into a coarse mix of white and iron trimmed short, not for style but habit. The thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket he wore was not chosen for warmth alone. It was the same kind he had worn for years, familiar in weight, familiar in smell, soaked with memories of smoke oil and long nights awake. Walter had survived combat, survived the slow erosion of peace afterward, survived a marriage that dissolved not in anger, but in quiet exhaustion. He had learned that noise passed and opinions faded, but cold, real cold, did not care what people thought. That lesson had been carved into him during a winter deployment decades earlier, when heat meant survival and ignorance could kill faster than bullets. Beside him sat Rex. The German shepherd was nearly 10 years old now, his muzzle dusted with gray ears, still erect, but no longer snapping instantly at every sound. His coat was dark sable thick and uneven from years of seasonal shedding, and his amber eyes tracked Walter with unwavering attention. Rex had the posture of a dog who had never needed training to be loyal. It was simply who he was. He had come into Walter's life after a long stretch of empty rooms and silent evenings, and since then the two had moved through days with a quiet understanding that required no words. Rex did not bark unless something truly mattered. He did not whine. He watched. Walter knelt near the corner of the cabin, resting one knee against the cold floorboards, ignoring the ache in his joints as he stretched a measuring cord between two walls that met at a perfect 90-degree angle. Most men would have pressed a fireplace flat against one wall the way it had always been done. That was faster, cheaper, familiar. Walter instead marked a diagonal line across the corner, his hands steady as the cord cut through the air at exactly 45 degrees. This was the spot. He could already hear the voices before they came. The cabin door creaked open without ceremony, letting in a blast of wind and the smell of snow. Tom Gallagher stepped inside, stamping his boots hard against the floor. Tom was in his early 50s, thick through the chest and stomach, with a bristling mustache and the permanent confidence of a man who had built the same thing the same way for most of his life. He wore a work jacket smeared with soot and sawdust, and his hands were permanently scarred from decades of construction jobs around Fargo. Tom glanced from the stones stacked near the wall to the measuring cord stretched oddly across the corner, then let out a short laugh. "Walter," Tom said, shaking his head, "you losing your mind in your old age? That's not how fireplaces work." Walter did not look up right away. He adjusted the cord a fraction of an inch, his fingers moving with careful precision. "That's how most of them work," he replied evenly. Tom stepped closer, squinting. "You're wasting space. And stone. You know how expensive that'll be. Fireplace goes flat against the wall. Always has." Behind Tom, Sarah Whitman hovered near the doorway, hesitant to step fully inside. She was in her early 40s, tall and slender with narrow shoulders and a posture that always seemed slightly guarded, as if she were bracing for something. Her light brown hair was pulled back into a loose braid, strands already escaping and brushing against a pale, wind-chapped face. Sarah had moved to Fargo only 3 years earlier, after her husband died suddenly of a heart condition, leaving her with 2 teenagers and more responsibility than she had ever wanted. She watched Walter with a mix of concern and curiosity, her gloved hands clasped together. "Walter," she said softly, "Tom's just worried. Winter's coming fast." Walter finally looked up. His eyes were calm, but there was something firm behind them, something immovable. "That's exactly why I'm doing it this way," he said. Tom snorted. "You're building a fireplace like it's floating in space. Heat'll go straight up the chimney. You'll freeze." Rex rose slowly to his feet, stepping closer to Walter's side. He did not growl, but his presence alone shifted the room's energy. Tom noticed and took a small step back, hands raised slightly. "Easy, boy," Tom muttered. Walter rested a hand briefly on Rex's back, fingers sinking into the thick fur. "He's fine," Walter said. "He just doesn't like shouting." The neighbors left soon after, shaking their heads, their laughter following them into the snow-heavy air. Outside, Walter could already hear the sound of hammers and saws as others hurried to finish their standard fireplaces before the ground froze solid. Speed mattered to them. Walter worked slowly. Over the following days, the ridicule grew. Men passing by would pause, glance inside the cabin, and exchange amused looks. Some offered advice. Others offered jokes. One called it a stupid old soldier's mistake. Walter heard every word. He simply stacked stone after stone, selecting each piece carefully, favoring dense sandstone that felt heavier than it looked. He embedded the structure deep into both walls, creating a mass that seemed excessive to anyone watching. At night, when the wind howled louder and the temperature dropped further, Walter sat on an overturned crate staring at the unfinished fireplace. Memories surfaced, uninvited, frozen boots, numb fingers, men shivering in silence while equipment failed. He remembered the panic of cold that crept in quietly, not all at once, convincing you that you were fine right up until you weren't. He also remembered what worked, what lasted. Rex would rest his head on Walter's knee, eyes half closed, warm and solid. The dog trusted him completely. That trust carried weight. By the time the first real snowstorm rolled through, Fargo Walter's fireplace stood nearly finished, angled and massive, consuming more space than any sensible builder would allow. The town had already decided he was wrong. Walter knew something they didn't. Winter had not yet shown its true face. And when it did, laughter would not keep anyone warm. Walter Hayes did not argue with anyone, not because he lacked words, but because he had learned long ago that explanations were wasted on people who had never been cold enough to be afraid. The wind pressed harder against the cabin, now sliding along the wooden seams, with a low, persistent whistle, and snow stacked itself against the outer walls, as if testing their resolve. Walter worked slowly, deliberately, each movement, measured each stone, lifted with care. His hands were thick knuckles enlarged from decades of labor and old injuries, fingers permanently stiffened by arthritis that flared whenever the temperature dropped. Even so, his grip was steady. He placed each block of sandstone with the patience of a man who knew that mistakes made in warmth were paid for in cold. Rex lay a few feet away, his body stretched along the floorboards, head resting on his paws. The dog's breathing was deep and even, but his ears flicked at every shift of the wind, every unfamiliar creak in the cabin. At nearly 10 years old, Rex was no longer impulsive. His movements had grown economical, his watchfulness quieter, shaped by years of mirroring Walter's own restraint. His dark sable coat absorbed what little warmth lingered in the room, and when Walter passed close by, Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and reassuring. As Walter stacked stone deeper into the corner, extending the structure into both walls, memories surfaced unbidden, rising from the same place where the cold still lived inside him. Korea had been white and endless, the kind of cold that erased sound and made men careless. He remembered nights when heat was rationed, when fires were forbidden, when survival depended on knowing how long warmth could be held and where it would disappear first. Men who chased heat burned through fuel and strength too quickly. Men who understood mass and shelter lasted longer. Walter had been young, then lean and sharp-eyed, still believing that skill alone could outpace nature. War corrected that belief. The firebox took shape, gradually angled inward rather than pressed obediently against a single wall. Walter adjusted the stones repeatedly, stepping back to study the geometry before committing to mortar. He measured not just space but flow, imagining how heat would travel, how it would rise, strike stone, and linger rather than escape. This was not guesswork. It was memory, refined by time. Outside, footsteps crunched in the snow. The door opened again, this time more cautiously. Sarah Whitman stepped inside, brushing snow from her boots. In the gray winter light, she looked thinner than before, and her frame narrow beneath a heavy coat that seemed a size too large. Her braid hung loosely over one shoulder, strands of hair escaping to frame a face marked by quiet fatigue rather than age. Sarah carried herself carefully, as though life had taught her that balance could be lost without warning. She glanced at the growing fireplace, then at Walter, her expression uncertain but curious. "I brought you some soup," she said, holding up a small container. "Figured you might forget to eat." Walter nodded once. "Thank you." She set it down near the stove and lingered, watching him work. Unlike Tom, she did not laugh. Her eyes traced the stonework, her brow furrowing slightly, as if trying to understand something she could not quite name. Sarah had learned after her husband's sudden death that certainty was fragile. That knowledge made her slower to judge. "My kids think you're building a fortress," she said gently. Walter allowed a faint smile to tug at the corner of his mouth. "Something like that." She hesitated, then asked, "You really think this'll work?" Walter wiped his hands on a cloth, standing slowly. When he turned to face her, there was no defiance in his eyes, only resolve. "I don't think," he said. "I know what fails." Sarah nodded, accepting the answer, even if she didn't fully understand it. She glanced at Rex, who had risen, and now stood beside Walter, solid and watchful. "He doesn't make a sound," she observed. "He will," Walter replied, "when it matters." She left shortly after, pulling her coat tighter as she stepped back into the cold. The door closed, sealing the cabin once more in silence and wind. That night the temperature dropped sharply. Frost crept across the inside of the windows in jagged patterns, and the unfinished fireplace loomed dark and massive in the corner. Walter lit a small test fire, not to warm the room, but to observe. He watched how the flames leaned, how the heat struck the angled stone, how the air shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. Rex lay nearby, eyes half-lidded, occasionally lifting his head to track the movement of shadows across the walls. Hours later, long after the flames had died down to embers, Walter pressed his palm against the stone. It was still warm, not hot, not blazing, but alive with stored heat. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. In neighboring cabins, men fed their fires constantly, chasing warmth that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Walter could hear the distant chopping of wood even late into the night, the frantic rhythm of preparation born from unease. He did not join them. Instead, he banked the coals, trusting the stone to do what fire alone could not. Near dawn, Rex stirred. His ears rose, his body tensing subtly. Walter opened his eyes, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a board cracked under the weight of ice. Rex relaxed, settling back down, satisfied. Walter reached out and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady strength beneath the fur. Morning came pale and unforgiving. The cold was deeper now, sharper, the kind that punished mistakes. Walter stepped outside briefly, his breath crystallizing in the air. Across the way, Tom Gallagher was already at work feeding his fire, face flushed and irritated. Their eyes met briefly. Tom said nothing. Neither did Walter. Back inside, the cabin felt different. Not warm yet, but not hostile either. The stone held its promise quietly, without spectacle. Walter sat on his crate, sipping Sarah's soup Rex at his feet, and allowed himself a rare moment of certainty. He knew winter was only beginning. He also knew he had prepared for the part most people never saw coming, the long, merciless stretch, when speed failed and only endurance remained. January arrived without ceremony, the kind of cold that did not announce itself with drama, but settled in with a steady, merciless patience, pressing Fargo into a narrow space between endurance and failure. The temperature fell past thresholds. People spoke of only in memory, sinking below -30 Celsius, and refusing to rise day after day, night after night, until even seasoned North Dakotans stopped checking thermometers and simply listened to the way wood snapped under stress, and glass sang faintly in its frames. Wind scoured the streets carrying powdered snow that slipped through the smallest seams, and the town's familiar routines began to fracture under the weight of the cold. Inside most homes, wall-mounted fireplaces roared, constantly devouring logs as fast as hands could feed them. Yet the heat clung stubbornly to the immediate space around the hearth and went no farther. Rooms beyond the fire's reach turned hostile corners, frosting over, breath-fogging. Even indoors, the air heavy with smoke that burned eyes and throats without offering relief. Men who had trusted speed and tradition found themselves awake at all hours, pacing between woodpiles and hearths, calculating how long their fuel would last, how long their bodies could. Tom Gallagher was among them. His broad confidence thinned as the days passed, his face reddened and raw from tending fires and hauling wood. The mustache that once gave him a look of solid authority was now stiff with frost whenever he stepped outside, and the lines around his eyes deepened into something closer to worry than age. Tom had built his fireplace exactly as he always had, flat against the wall, efficient on paper, quick to construct. But now it betrayed him. Heat pooled near the stones and vanished upward, pulled greedily by the chimney, leaving the far side of his cabin so cold that water froze solid in cups left overnight. He burned through a week's worth of firewood in days, then days' worth in hours, the rhythm of survival accelerating into something unsustainable. Each time he passed Walter's place, he noticed the same strange detail that gnawed at him: clear windows. No ice flowers, no white haze, just glass reflecting pale winter light. Sarah Whitman felt the change differently. Her house was smaller, easier to heat in theory, but the cold found her children's rooms first, creeping under doors and settling low. She was tall and slender, her movements economical, shaped by years of managing, more than she let on. Her skin, fair and easily chapped, stayed perpetually flushed from the cold, and her braid had grown looser as the days blurred together, strands escaping as she moved between chores and worry. At night, she layered blankets over her teenagers, listening to the fire crackle and die back too quickly, counting logs, counting hours. She did not burn furniture, not yet, but the thought hovered at the edge of her mind, unwelcome and persistent. Each morning she noticed Walter's chimney, the smoke thin and steady rather than frantic, rising cleanly into the frozen air. Inside Walter Hayes's cabin, the difference was not dramatic, in the way movies like to make survival look. There was no roaring inferno, no excessive heat. There was simply balance. The stone fireplace, now fully finished, sat angled in the corner, like a deliberate defiance of habit, its mass extending into both walls, heavy and immovable. Walter fed it modestly in the evenings, 2 armloads of hardwood, building a controlled fire that burned clean and steady. He watched the flames strike the angled firebox, felt the subtle shift of air as warmth moved outward instead of racing upward. When the fire burned down to coals, he banked it carefully and went to bed without fear. Hours later, when he rose to tend Rex or pour water, the stone still held warmth, radiating quietly, evenly, refusing to surrender what it had taken. Rex thrived in the calm. The German shepherd sprawled across the floor, his aging joints spared the ache that cold inflicted elsewhere. His breathing remained slow and deep, his coat glossy despite the season. He did not shiver. He did not pace. He slept the untroubled sleep of a creature who sensed stability at a level beyond reason. When Walter moved, Rex followed not anxiously, but with the assurance of routine. The dog's silence became a marker. As long as Rex was at ease, Walter knew the cabin was holding. By the 5th day of sustained extreme cold, the town's confidence cracked. The familiar rules no longer applied. Standard fireplaces failed in ways people had never needed to consider. Chimney drafts reversed under pressure from dense frozen air, pushing smoke back into living spaces. Stonework cracked with sharp reports that echoed like gunfire in the night as materials expanded and contracted beyond their limits. Some families began closing off rooms, entirely retreating into single heated spaces, dragging mattresses closer to the fire. Others burned chairs, shelves, anything combustible their homes slowly cannibalized, in exchange for a few more hours of heat. Walter observed without commentary. He did not feel triumph, only a sober recognition of patterns he had seen before. Cold revealed truth without malice. It stripped away assumptions and left only what worked. One afternoon, while the sky hung low and colorless, Tom Gallagher appeared at Walter's door. He looked smaller somehow, his heavy coat hanging open, his posture less certain. His beard stubble was thick and uneven, and his eyes darted past Walter into the cabin, drawn to the unmistakable warmth that greeted him. Steam rose faintly from his shoulders as he stepped inside. "Mind if I warm up a minute?" Tom asked, his voice rough. Walter stepped aside. "Come in." Tom stood awkwardly near the entrance, hands outstretched, staring at the stone walls as if they might explain themselves. "It's..." Even he muttered. "Same temperature everywhere." Walter nodded. "That's the point." Tom shook his head slowly, something like disbelief settling over his features. "I've been burning non-stop." "Doesn't matter." He swallowed. "You did something different." "I did something older," Walter replied. Sarah came later that evening, her face tight with concern. She did not bring soup this time. She brought questions. Standing near the fireplace, she listened as Walter explained in simple terms how mass held heat, how angles mattered, how patience outlasted force. She pressed her palm to the stone and closed her eyes briefly, relief softening her shoulders. For the first time in days, she did not rush home immediately. Outside, the cold deepened further, testing every structure, every decision. Inside Walter's cabin, the stone remained warm through the night, the air steady, the silence unbroken, except for Rex's breathing and the occasional soft tick of cooling wood. By morning, the truth was visible from the street, while frost clung to every other window. Walter's remained clear. The town noticed. The laughter stopped. In its place grew something quieter, heavier attention. The first knock came just after dusk, hesitant at first, then firmer, as if pride had finally been forced aside by necessity. And when Walter Hayes opened the door, the cold rushed in behind Tom Gallagher, like a living thing clawing at the warmth that had taken days to build. Tom looked exhausted. His broad shoulders slumped beneath layers of heavy clothing, his beard rimmed with ice eyes red not only from smoke, but from nights without rest. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, breathing hard, staring past Walter at the steady glow of the stone fireplace and the unmistakable calm of a room that was not fighting for survival. Behind him waited his wife Ellen, a stout woman in her late 40s with wind-burned cheeks and hands rough from years of work, clutching a blanket around herself, and their youngest son, pale and silent, his lips faintly blue despite the scarf wrapped tight around his face. Walter stepped aside without ceremony, the gesture practiced almost military, and they entered, steam rising from their coats as the heat reclaimed them inch by inch. Word traveled fast in the cold. By the time Tom's family had settled near the far wall, Sarah Whitman arrived with her 2 teenagers, their shoulders hunched, their bravado stripped away by fear they did not know how to name. Sarah's face was drawn but resolute, her tall frame rigid with the determination of someone who had already lost too much to lose more. She did not ask. She met Walter's eyes, and he nodded once, understanding everything she could not bring herself to say. Soon after came Harold Bennett, an elderly widower whose hands shook constantly from an old injury sustained decades earlier in a factory accident. His thin frame swallowed by a threadbare coat, and behind him a young couple Walter barely knew, Mark and Lila Evans, both in their late 20s, Lila visibly pregnant, her round belly straining against layers of clothing, her face pale and damp with sweat despite the cold. Mark was lean and sharp-featured with a narrow jaw and a patchy beard that spoke of stress more than style, his eyes darting constantly as if the walls themselves might betray him. The cabin filled slowly, carefully, until there were 14 people within its wooden walls. Bodies arranged in quiet clusters, children wrapped in blankets, adults standing or sitting wherever space allowed. The air grew thick, not with smoke, but with breath, the sound of it layered and human, punctuated by the occasional cough or whispered reassurance. Rex moved among them with deliberate calm, his dark body weaving gently between legs, pausing here and there to sniff a sleeve, a hand, a child's hair, his tail low but relaxed. He was not anxious. He was assessing. When he finished his circuit, he returned to his place near the fireplace and lay down satisfied, as if confirming what Walter already knew: everyone here was safe for now. Walter stood near the stone hearth, his presence anchoring the room. He spoke little, but when questions came, he answered them plainly, without pride or performance. He explained that the fire did not need to be large, that flames were fleeting, things impressive but unreliable, and that the real work was done by what surrounded them. He tapped the stone with his knuckles, the sound deep and solid. "This holds what the fire gives," he said. "Heat doesn't like to be chased. It likes to be caught." He demonstrated how the angled firebox sent warmth outward instead of upward, how the mass embedded in 2 walls stored energy that bled back slowly, evenly through the night. Mark listened with intense focus, nodding repeatedly, his hand resting protectively on Lila's back, while Tom watched with a mixture of awe and something close to regret. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the door, but inside the temperature barely shifted. Children fell asleep first, exhaustion overtaking fear, their breathing evening out, as the warmth settled deep into their bones. Ellen Gallagher pressed a hand to the stone wall and shook her head slowly, disbelief softening into gratitude. Sarah sat with her back straight, eyes closed, her shoulders finally dropping as tension drained away. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to imagine morning without panic. Harold Bennett sat quietly, hands extended toward the heat, his trembling easing until they rested, almost still, tears slipping down the deep lines of his face without sound. The night stretched on. Walter tended the fire once, adding only a small amount of wood, then banked it carefully. Hours later, when the flames had faded to a dull glow, the stone remained warm to the touch, radiating a steady comfort that required no attention, no sacrifice. Rex lifted his head briefly when the door creaked under a gust of wind, then settled again, satisfied. The cabin became something more than shelter. It became proof. By morning, frost covered the town like a verdict. From Walter's windows, clear and unclouded, he could see the damage unfolding elsewhere. Chimneys cracked, smoke spilling sideways, men dragging broken furniture into yards to burn in desperation. Inside, people stirred slowly, reluctant to break the fragile peace. Mark whispered to Walter that Lila had slept through the night without shivering, that her breathing had steadied, that the baby kicked strong and regular. Walter nodded the news landing with quiet weight. When daylight strengthened, neighbors stood outside Walter's cabin, not laughing now, but watching, counting the steady plume of smoke, noting how little wood had been consumed. No one spoke loudly. No one mocked. The lesson had written itself in ice and survival. Inside, Walter moved among his guests with the same calm efficiency he had learned long ago, distributing blankets, checking faces, ensuring no one slipped back toward the cold. He did not consider himself a hero. He had simply built something that worked, and when it mattered, he had opened the door. Spring arrived in Fargo without celebration, creeping in slowly, as if unsure whether it was welcome after the violence of the winter that had come before it. And when the snow finally began to retreat, it revealed more than thawed ground and broken branches. It exposed how close the town had come to losing itself. The laughter that once followed Walter Hayes, wherever he worked, did not return. In its place came a quieter sound: questions. Men who had once mocked the angled stone fireplace now stood awkwardly in his doorway, hats in hand, eyes lowered not in shame, but in something closer to humility. They asked about measurements, about stone weight, about why certain rocks cracked, while others held about how deep the mass had to run into the walls, about why heat behaved differently when it was guided instead of forced. Walter answered each question without impatience, without pride. He did not speak like a teacher delivering revelation, but like a man recalling things he had been taught long ago and never forgotten. Walter himself looked unchanged. He still wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, faded now at the elbows, smelling faintly of smoke and stone dust. His posture remained straight, his movements unhurried. The winter had not bent him, but it had aged the town around him. Faces that once carried easy certainty now showed fine lines etched by worry and long nights without sleep. Tom Gallagher, once so loud in his confidence, listened more than he spoke, his heavy frame thinner from weeks of burning calories. To stay warm, his eyes sharper now, less dismissive. He worked beside Walter on several mornings, dismantling his old wall-mounted fireplace piece by piece, salvaging what stone could be reused, discarding what had failed. The work was slow and physical, and Tom did not rush it. Something in him had shifted, reshaped by watching his family survive only because another man had chosen differently. Sarah Whitman changed in quieter ways. As the cold loosened its grip, she stood taller, her movements less guarded, though the memory of that winter never left her eyes. She cut her hair shorter, the braid gone, replaced by a practical style that framed her face and made her look stronger, more resolved. Her children returned to school thinner but alive, and Sarah began helping neighbors organize shared firewood storage and rebuilding schedules. She spoke often of balance of preparation, of not assuming that what had worked once would always work again. When she visited Walter, she brought notebooks filled with careful handwriting, recording details not just for herself but for others. She did not call what he did genius. She called it listening. Rex aged through the spring, as dogs always do, suddenly and gently at the same time. His muzzle whitened further, his steps slowed, but his presence remained steady, grounding. He followed Walter from site to site, as fireplaces were rebuilt, lying near foundations, watching unfamiliar hands lift stone with the same calm authority he had always shown. Children reached for him now without fear, resting small palms against his broad back, learning what safety felt like without words. Rex accepted this quietly, his loyalty expanding to include the town that had once stood outside his door, cold and desperate. By early summer, the change was visible across Fargo. Chimneys were rebuilt at angles once considered foolish. Stone walls thickened. Firewood stacks shrank. Houses that had once burned through supplies now required less preparation, less labor, less fear. People spoke differently too, with fewer absolutes, fewer jokes at another's expense. They spoke of winter not as an inconvenience, but as a test, one that would return eventually, indifferent to pride or tradition. Walter never claimed credit. When thanked, he shrugged and said only that there were ways of building meant for comfort, and ways meant for survival, and the difference mattered when conditions turned cruel. One afternoon, Mark and Lila Evans returned to Walter's cabin, not in crisis this time, but carrying a newborn wrapped carefully against Lila's chest. The baby's skin was pink and strong, his fists clenched with instinctive determination. Lila looked tired but radiant, her posture cautious yet proud, while Mark's sharp features had softened his voice, quieter, steadier. They named the boy Samuel, a name that carried weight, continuity, and the promise of endurance. Walter held the child briefly, his hands large and steady, the warmth of the stone at his back, and felt something loosen inside him that he had not realized had been held tight for decades. Rex sniffed the baby's foot and lay down nearby, approving. The town council eventually asked Walter to speak to explain what he had done and why. He stood before them reluctantly, hat in hand, eyes scanning familiar faces now marked by shared memory. He did not use technical language. He spoke instead of lessons learned the hard way of winters that killed careless men of knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next because survival demanded it. He reminded them that speed was a luxury and that efficiency without understanding was just another form of waste. When he finished, there was no applause, only nods, the kind that carried real weight. As summer deepened, Walter returned to his routines. He fixed what needed fixing. He walked Rex along the riverbank in the evenings. He sat on his porch and watched the light change, knowing winter would come again, as it always did. But this time, Fargo would meet it differently. Not because of innovation, but because of memory reclaimed. Walter did not consider that a victory. He considered it balance restored. In a world that praised the new and rushed toward the next solution, the town had learned something older, something quieter. That survival was often not about invention, but about remembering what had already been proven under harsher skies by people who had no margin for error. And as the days lengthened and the cold receded into memory, the angled stone fireplaces stood as silent witnesses not to brilliance but to wisdom that refused to be forgotten. In the end, this story was never just about stone fire or winter. It was about a quiet miracle, the kind that doesn't arrive with thunder or spectacle, but through wisdom placed in human hands long before we are born. Some call it experience. Some call it tradition. Others recognize it as grace. Because when knowledge passes from one generation to another, at the exact moment it is needed most, that is not an accident. That is provision. That is God working through ordinary people in ordinary places at extraordinary times. In our daily lives, we often rush toward what is new, loud, and fast, believing it will save us. Yet again and again, we learn that survival, peace, and even healing often come from slowing down, listening, and honoring the lessons written by those who walked before us. Just like that angled fireplace, many of the answers we need are already here, quiet, overlooked, waiting for us to trust them. If this story touched you, let it be a reminder to look for wisdom in the simple things to value, patience over pride, and to remember that God's miracles often arrive disguised as common-sense kindness or a door opened at the right moment. If you believe in these kinds of stories of hope, endurance, and faith, please share this video with someone who may need encouragement today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories that warm the heart as much as they challenge the mind. May God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm in every season of life. May He guide your steps, strengthen your home, and grant you peace wherever you are watching from.